action potential. We talked about that last week and the different phases of action potential. I'm going to develop a table for you. And so, as I always emphasize, the table is just a good summary of information that you need to know going forward. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to talk about the conduction of action potentials down along the length of axons. And if time permits, I'll talk to you about multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disorder that specifically attacks the myelin of our neurons. That's it. That's the game plan for tonight here. So with that, let me get going here. So I'm just going to put a graph of action potential up here and make sure that you understand that the y-axis of this graph is the membrane potential. And the units that we use to describe membrane potential are millivolts. And typically, the scale might start at minus 100 millivolts. And I'm just going to go up in increments of 50 millivolts. So I've got minus 50 millivolts, 0, and then we'll say 50 millivolts. You now know that there's this property of membranes, and it's called threshold. And our textbook value for threshold is going to be 40 millivolts, minus 40 millivolts, unless I tell you something differently. What is threshold? Anybody? What is threshold? I'll be back. What's threshold? What's that? Why would it be polarized? Okay, so along those lines, what is threshold? It's a membrane potential that causes all of the voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open up. If we're below threshold, none of the voltage-gated sodium ion channels open. If we hit threshold, all of them open. So here at threshold, I'm just going to write, this is a membrane potential that causes all voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open. Here's our cell in a resting state. I'm just going to write resting, capital V subscript M, and you're just going to read that as a resting membrane potential. We come along, and at this point, we excite our cell. And we excite it with a stimulus that's strong enough to get to threshold. And when that happens, we generate this electrical event that we refer to as an action potential. There are different phases in this action potential. Here I'm just going to write D-E-P-O-L, depolarization. Up here I'm going to draw a little lasso, and we're going to refer to this simply as the peak of the action potential. We then have this phase where the membrane potential begins to return back to its normal resting level. This is known as repolarization. For a brief moment, the cell hyperpolarizes. In other words, it repolarizes more than normal. And we refer to that as hyperpolarization. And as I've said to you before, I'm showing the hyperpolarization leading to a membrane potential of right around about minus 92 millivolts. Why does it go there? Because that's the equilibrium potential for potassium. So this is hyperpolarization. So in this table, in the left-hand column, we're going to put the phases of the action potential. We'll start out with the resting membrane potential. And here we're going to put key membrane. I'm going to put key ROT, and in parentheses I'm going to put an S, because it may not be a single protein. And then we're going to put ion flux. Well, in talking about the resting membrane potential, the key membrane protein is the leaky potassium ion channel. What's the direction of flux? Anybody? Can't hear you guys. Don't be bashful. What's the direction of flux?
Inside the cell. Inside the cell.
Inside the cell. So potassium is flowing into the cell, right? Right? Yeah, sounds good. Right? Don't know? Don't care? What would you say? Out of the cell, it is, according to its electrochemical gradient. So we've got the efflux. Of potassium ions. If the cell is losing positive charge, then the membrane potential is going to be what? Positive or negative? It's going to be negative. That's why we're here. Is because we've got those leaky potassium ion channels that are always open. They're allowing potassium positive charge to leave the cell. We come along and we use a stimulus that gets the cell to threshold. And so now the membrane depolarizes. What's the key membrane protein? And the answer is voltage-gated sodium ion channels. What's the direction of flux?
Into the cell.
Into the cell. What's the concentration of sodium outside the cell?
140.
Okay, what is it inside the cell?
46.
Good, good. Yeah, so we have this strong electrochemical gradient that favors the influx of sodium. So now we have positive charge entering the cell, and that positive charge causes the membrane potential to become positive. And the peak of the action potential is fairly close to the equilibrium potential for sodium. And one of our rules, the general rule, is that the membrane potential can only be at or near the equilibrium potential of an ion if the membrane is permeable to that ion. So the only way we can get close to the equilibrium potential for sodium is if somehow the membrane magically becomes permeable to sodium, allowing sodium to enter the cell. The next phase. The next phase, we have the peak of the action potential. And here, the key membrane that's involved is the voltage-gated sodium ion channel, which spontaneously closes. It's said to be spontaneously inactivated. So here I'm just going to say spontaneous inactivation. You could put closure. And so at this point, we have no influx. I'll just put no further influx of sodium. So these voltage-gated sodium ion channels, they open up very quickly. They then spontaneously close all on their own. And it takes them a while to reset so that they can be opened up. But while that's happening, we've also got these voltage-gated potassium ion channels that have opened. And as it turns out, we're starting up here. Here's our cell. And here's how you gotta be able to think about this on the test. Here we are at plus 60 millivolts. So the membrane potential is now 60 millivolts. We're not doing anything to change the concentration of potassium. So the concentration gradient, delta C, for potassium favors the efflux. But now, you gotta put your thinking cap on and understand that the inside of the cell has a positive charge. Coulomb's rule says that like charges repel. And so now we've got an electrical gradient that also favors the efflux of potassium. And when we combine these two individual forces, we have a very large electrochemical gradient that favors the efflux of potassium. So here we've got, let me put the word opening of voltage gated sodium ion channels there. Here we've got the opening of voltage gated potassium ion channels. And as I just said, this leads to an efflux of potassium ions, causing the membrane potential to become more negative. And then we get to this last phase, which is called hyperpolarization. So if everybody will look at the graph here, if I can get everybody's eyes up here, please. So what causes this to be at minus 70 millivolts? The leaky potassium ion channel. But now here's the important part. Why do we drop below that minus 70 millivolts? And it's because now, in addition to the leaky potassium ion channels, for a short period of time, we also have some of our voltage gated potassium ion channels that are open. And so the conductance for potassium is greater than under normal resting conditions here. The conductance is greater here, causing us to basically reach the equilibrium potential for potassium. So over here, under hyperpolarization, we have the voltage gated potassium ion channels plus the leaky potassium ion channels. But you have to understand, you have to remember that I told you the leaky potassium ion channels are always open. Keyword is always. Yes? Let me just come on over here because I got that thing where they're making lots of noise. You're talking about leaky sodium ion channels? No such thing. So we have leaky potassium ion channels, there's no leaky sodium ion channels. Does that help? Yeah, if you've kind of given me a great idea for a test question. And here it is. If you had a leaky sodium ion channel and there were no leaky potassium ion channels, where would the resting membrane potential be? Your answer. Yeah, that sounds reasonable, right? Is that it would be somewhere that's maybe up around 50 plus 40 millivolts.
But then if there was no other channels involved, two lights and the rest of the negative 92.
Why isn't it at minus 92? Because we've got our sodium potassium ATP as well, which is always maintaining this 3-to-2 ratio. Okay. Other questions about that? Don't be bashful, speak up. I just wrote efflux of potassium.
They're all non-response of the voltage-gated sodium channels. It us up when it's depolarized. How about when it's shut down? Is it also all non-response?
What do you mean? What are you talking about in terms of all animals?
At the peak of the action potential, when the sodium channels are closed, do they close in
All
or not in
of
this
them, all of them inactivated. Sit there and think about it. If we only had half of them that's inactivated, then the membrane potential might do something like this. So that membrane potential, all it is a balance between the ions that are coming in and the ions that are going out. Now, just to give you to reinforce an important thing is that when you were working with your metaneuron lab, you were supposed to have clicked on a little button for either TTX or TEA. So TTX comes along and it basically blocks these guys right here. So when you treat an excitable cell using things like tetrodotoxin, which is a sodium ion channel blocker, you're not going to be able to produce an action potential. And also I mentioned to you, thinking about in the clinical world, you have things like lidocaine. You can have novocaine. There's marcaine. Bupivacaine. All of these, that was good. All of these, you'll notice that they all have this word cane in them. All of those are voltage-gated sodium ion channel blockers. And lidocaine is used incredibly on a regular basis. All right. So now let's continue the story a little bit. Here's our very simple version of a neuron. This is the neuron that ate New York City. It's huge. And you guys have seen this scheme before, but this region where the nucleus of the cell is located, this is the soma. I'm just going to put a little arrow pointing to this black dot here. This is the nucleus. We've got these finger-like projections. Coming out the soma, you would tell me that some of those are our dendrites. We can have these very long projections coming off of the soma. And this represents the axon. And then we've got the axon terminal. And the question is, what's the distribution of key proteins along the length of this neuron? So over here, at the level of the dendrite, we've got sodium, potassium, ATPase pumps. And they're found all along the length of this neuron. So the sodium, potassium, ATPase pumps are found all along the entire length of the neuron. There are leaky potassium ion channels. These are found all along the length of the neuron. So, just to be clear, when I'm saying they're found all along the length of the neuron, I'm talking about beginning at the dendrites, the membrane of the soma, the membrane of the axon, the membrane of the axon terminal. Receptor-gated ion channels. Receptor-gated ion channels are found here. So I'm just going to put R period for receptor, G for gated, and then I put ion channel. So receptor-gated ion channels, for the simple story, are found in the membrane of dendrites. Our voltage-gated sodium ion channels. Are found all along the length of the axon down to the axon terminal. Our voltage-gated potassium ion channels. Are found all along the length of the axon into the axon terminal. The voltage-gated calcium ion channels. They're found only in the membrane of the axon terminal. Where's Kent Wynn? Mr. Wynn. Kent, first night in class, I talked about 3 fundamental principles of physiology. What was principle number 1?
Structure determines function.
That's right. Exactly. So based upon that principle, if you didn't hear him, he said that the first principle was structure determines function. So the question for him, but for all of you is, given that principle, where in the neuron do action potentials occur? Do they occur in dendrites?
They occur in the axon. The axon.
The axon and...
Axon terminal.
That's right. That's exactly right. So when we talk about action potentials can only be produced where there are these voltage-gated sodium ion channels. The release of neurotransmitter. It's dependent upon what? Calcium ions. Where are voltage-gated calcium ion channels? They're in the membrane of the axon terminal, right where our neurotransmitter vesicles are. So now I need you to listen very, very carefully. Very carefully. These axons can be very long. We're taught, all of us are taught, that cells are microscopic. They're small. Well, yes and no. Because motor neurons, where are motor neurons found? You should have learned this in your anatomy class. Where are motor neurons found? If you don't know what a motor neuron is, it's a neuron that controls a bunch of muscle fibers. Where are these motor neurons found? They're found in the brain, right? Where all the neurons of the body are located. Spinal cord. That's exactly right. Our motor neurons are our spinal cord. As a matter of fact, I want all of you to try this. I want you to sitting there, I want you to just do what I'm doing. Right now, in my right shoe, I'm taking my toes and I'm coming along and I'm flexing. The motor neuron that was responsible for that is in the sacral region of the spinal cord. And its axonal projection comes out of the spinal cord and travels down the back of the leg, down the bottom of the leg, into your foot. Now, does that seem like a small cell to you? Because right now, I'm thinking that that axon of that cell is almost 3 feet in length. That seems like a big cell to me. What do you think? Yeah, no? So to get my muscles of my foot to flex my toes, I have to depolarize that motor neuron. That means it produces an action potential. But what the heck is really what's really going on? It's more complex. I'm just saying that that motor neuron produces an action potential. So now what I'm going to talk to you about is what is known as the propagation of the action potential. Now can somebody go out really quick, I'm serious about this, go out and just Google the definition of the word propagate. Like to see what Google says that word means, to propagate. Yes, sir, Mr. Corey.
Okay, there's multiple definitions. I'm going to go with the last one. Transmit or be transmitted in a particular direction or period.
Okay, all right. Anybody else?
Spread and promote.
Say that again.
Spread and promote.
To spread and promote.
An idea, theory, etc.
That's a propagation of an idea. But we're in biology, right? Ideas are biology, right? I mean, that's our brain.
Breed specimen of biological processes from the parents.
Say that again.
Breed specimens.
Breed specimen
Of a plant or animal by natural processes.
by natural process. Which natural process can she be alluding to?
Sexual reproduction.
To propagate, to make new. This might throw some of you off, but your parents propagated. Did they not? And this might really freak some of you out. Some of you in here will propagate to make new. And so we need to talk about the propagation of the action potential. So I'm going to take this part of the diagram This is our cell. All of you are going to tell me that the resting membrane potential in the cell everywhere along the length of the cell is minus 7 millivolts. So I'm just going to come along and I'm going to write minus 70 millivolts. If I measure right here. And if I measure over here, it's minus 70 millivolts. And if I measure here, it's minus 70 millivolts. And if I do the same thing down along the length, it's minus 70 millivolts. Remember, we're talking about a big cell, not a little teeny weeny cell. So this word to propagate, we're going to say to make new. And that's kind of consistent with the definition that you came up with, just different words. Same thing. Well, I'm going to show the presence of a voltage-gated sodium ion channel. And this voltage-gated sodium ion channel is closed. I'm just showing it with little doors so that it's blocking the movement of sodium ions. And we come along and we stimulate the cell here. Here's where the stimulus is coming. The stimulus is coming here. And I get this part, this initial part of the axon, to minus 60 millivolts. Will we produce an action potential? Will we produce an action potential? No, we won't. If I come along and there's a stimulus that arrives at the level of the dendrites and it gets this part of our membrane to minus 50 millivolts, will we produce an action potential? No, we won't, because we didn't get the threshold. If we can get to minus 40 millivolts, then we're going to produce an action potential. But you have to understand, the action potential is not being produced here. It's not being produced here. It's being produced where our voltage-gated sodium ion channels are located. And we're talking about this long distance that action potential has to be able to travel down. That action potential, when you sit there and flex your toes, has to be able to go basically from the sacral level of the spinal cord all the way down to your toes. That's a long distance. So here's our voltage-gated sodium ion channel. And let's say we get the membrane to threshold. Now, listen carefully. The density of these voltage-gated sodium ion channels is very high. Let me give you a number. 3,000 of them per square micron. That's a really, really small little area, and there we would find 3,000 voltage-gated sodium ion channels. So the voltage-gated sodium ion channels are packed together very, very closely. Everybody with me on that? So there's not big distances between them. There's very, very, very short distances between them. And here's another a set of voltage-gated sodium ion channels. And here's another one, another set. And while you might sit there and say, wow, the distances between these here is really large, I'm talking about a very microscopic part of an axon. Even though it looks big to you, try to appreciate that the distances here are incredibly small. What do you think? Any confusion on that? All right. So how is it that I get an action potential here that travels all the way down the length of the axon to the axon terminal. And that's through this process known as the propagation of an action potential. So I come along, I get this part of the membrane, the threshold. When that happens, the voltage gated sodium ion channel opens up. And now, I'm just using a silly little numbers game. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 sodium ions are going to come in. And what are they going to do? They're going to move around randomly. What do we call random molecular motion? Starts with a D, diffusion. And so these sodium ions are going to diffuse. Some of them are going to be here. I'm going to put 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of them are going to diffuse back to your left. I'm going to put 1, 2, 3. And some are going to diffuse to your right. I'm going to put 1, 2, 3. And now what's going to happen is all of a sudden there's positive ions here. And what's that going to do to the membrane potential? Is that going to cause the membrane potential to stay at minus 70 millivolts, or to be even lower at minus 90 millivolts? Or is the membrane potential going to arise? Is it going to depolarize? Hopefully all can say that it's going to depolarize. And so now I've got the second bunch of voltage gated sodium ion channels that open up. And now the second bunch comes in. Oops. And that causes this third bunch of voltage gated sodium ion channels to open up. And so, as we're going along, basically, there's an action potential being produced here, which causes an action potential to be produced here, which causes an action potential to be produced here, and it just is propagated down along the length of the axon until we get to the axon terminal. Let me stop there and ask if there are any questions. Don't be bashful, speak up. So the point is, an action potential here is not going to magically cause voltage gated sodium ion channels over here to open up. Rather, what we have to do is we have to spread the action potential down along the length of the axon and propagate it, make it new. We have to make the action potential new. The opening of this causes all the voltage gated sodium ion channels here to open up, which causes depolarization. That then causes all the voltage gated sodium ion channels here to open up and see depolarization, and it just spreads on down along the length of the axon. Now, if that's confusing to you, please don't be bashful. Please speak up and say, I don't get it, or it doesn't make sense. Now, what I'm showing you can be used to, we can use an analogy. Here's the analogy. And, nowadays, I know none of you have ever played with Transformers because it's much more fun to play on the computer. Of course, I'm joking. How many of you in here have played with Transformers? Don't be bashful. Come on, ladies. How many of you played Transformers? Come on, ladies. I know some of you in here have played Transformers. How about poppy beads? I'm not talking about pop beads. Anybody here know what a poppy bead is? Poppy bead is like a little plastic bead, and you stick it and connect it to another one and another one. Another one, you can make all different types of colors. That was popular in the 1950s. Where you guys been? All right. All teasing aside, have any of you in here played with dominoes? Now that's fun, right? Dominoes are, we all get the idea of dominoes. So here's the domino effect. So I get this one here. We'll say this is that first set of voltage-gated sodium ion channels to tip over, and because it's close enough to the second group here, that causes all these voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open. Being a domino, it tips over here and causes the third, and then the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, and a gazillion of them later. What do you think? Does that seem like a system that can propagate an action potential very quickly down the length of that axon, or is it going to be relatively slow? What would you say, Mr. King? What do you say, Michael?
I would think it's, they're propagate quickly.
Quicker, okay. I have it quickly. Anybody else?
It's relying on diffusion, right? So if there's an area that doesn't have like a high density of, sodium channels, then slow down or stop, right?
Okay, all right. So you're saying it's going to be slow, right?
Ish, I guess.
You say? Yeah. Okay. So I got two fast. I got one slow.
This is a good question.
Oh, we've got two fast, one slow, and a question.
Yeah. Would the negative 70 millivolts from battery potential on the receiving side, instead of coming out, would that attract any sodium ions that entered in? It's like the propagation waves.
Well, the local membrane potential, so local, I'm sitting there saying here, is what's responsible for the electrochemical gradient here,
Oh, okay.
right? So the answer is slow. Very slow. So it can come along. And modify the structure. And here I'm going to put an insulator around the axon. Let's see here. I'm thinking of a name. It starts with an E. And I'm having a hard time remembering the last part. Yes, I got it. Elizabeth. Miss Elizabeth. In anatomy, you should have learned about the special type of insulation we find in neurons. What's the name of that? Well, that's not the name of the insulator. The oligodendrocytes are producing what? Anybody? Myelin, right? So we have this insulator called myelin. Myelin's being produced by cells that are called, starts with the S, ends with an N. Say it louder. Schwann cells, that's right. So myelin. Just to be clear, let me come along and go back to an important part here. So here's this domino scheme. I gotta open up this voltage gate, this set of voltage gates, so 9 channels, open this one, open this one, open that one, that one, that one, that one, so forth and so on. That's a slow velocity that the action potential is going to spread down along the length of the axon. What if I could come along and I could use an insulator, just as I had up here. And I've got this myelin that's being produced by these Schwann cells, and now Kathy Lee, where's Kathy? Kathy, what are these regions called right here? If you don't know, you don't know. Not sure? Anybody, what are those known as? Yeah. Very good, excellent. So these regions are known as the node of Ranvier. So what I'm doing is I'm telling you that there can be axons that are non-myelinated, and then there are other axons that are said to be myelinated axons. And for the myelinated axons, we've got this insulating material that allows the action potential to skip from one node of Ranvier down to the other. So rather than kind of this domino form of the propagation, here our propagation has kind of this skipping where the action potential is able to skip down fairly large lengths of the action potential. And this is called saltatory conduction. Now, the speed at which the action potential moves down along the length of the axon is known as the conduction velocity. So what we're talking about is the propagation, the speed at which the action potential is propagated down along the length of the axon. So we're talking about conduction velocity, and there are two main factors that determine conduction velocity. Number one, the degree of myelination. And number two is the radius of the axon. And the rule is the greater the radius, the greater the conduction velocity. Now, here's just a real world story. I suspect many of you in here, maybe all of you in here, at one time or another have come along and went to touch something. And let's say that you felt a sharp object and you can very quickly retracted your hand. Or if you work in a kitchen and you put your hand on something and it surprises you in terms of how hot it is. It's amazing how quickly you'll retract your hand. I sit there and think about that. The motor neuron that's controlling the muscles of my arm, those are in the thoracic region, so here. But there's a long axon coming out here. And the speed at which you can do that is amazingly fast. So you would tell me that in those motor neurons, do they have a large radius? Yes, they do. Do they have a high degree of myelination? Yes, they do. There are other types of neurons that are not myelinated, and they have small radius, and they have no myelin. And their conduction velocities are very slow. So let me give you some numbers here, just to try to impress upon you what's happening. So the conduction velocity of myelinated axons is somewhere between about 40 to 100 meters per second. Let me tell you, that's darn fast. Darn fast. Do you watch football? I can tell you do. Come on, go with me. Yeah, you watch it, don't you? What's your favorite team? Is it the Kansas City Chiefs? Come on, I need a lady in here to watch this football. Come on, go watch this football. What's your team? The Niners. Right? Is that what you're saying? How are they doing this year? Last time I checked, they're 2-2. Yeah. If you're a football player and you could run 100 meters in 1 second, what do you think you're worth? You come to me. You have events I can run 100 meters in 1 second. How much do I have to pay you? He's not being shy. He says he wants all of the team salary. Is that what I heard you say? If you could run 100 meters in 1 second, guess what? As a football player, you would score a touchdown every time you touch that football. There's nobody can do it. There's only one problem. If there was that freak moment where somebody did tackle you and you were going 100 meters a second, your football career would be over. Do you know what type of ending football injury you're talking about? It starts with a D and it ends with an A. And there's an O in between. What is that? DOA. Not sure? Come on, help them out. What is DOA? Death on arrival. You have so much kinetic energy that you hit something, you're not going to make it. That's how fast that is. Sit there and think. Watch a football game. Watch a football game this weekend. Imagine going 100 meters in 1 second. That's incredibly fast. Okay, well, one last part, and then I'll shut up. Sadly, there is an autoimmune disorder that attacks the myelin. Yeah, what's the name of that autoimmune disorder? Multiple sclerosis. Very good. Most often referred to as MS. Well, if we've got an individual who's developed MS, and now we've come along and we basically have destroyed the myelin, are we going to be able to generate an action potential down along the length of this axon where there is this huge distance between the voltage-gated sodium ion channels? And the answer is no, will not. Now, by the way, that word sclerosis, what does that mean? Anybody, just gotta Google, look it up. I want you guys to go ahead and Google it right now. Sclerosis, what does that word mean? What's that? Survey says. Take it, please.
Hardening of tissue and disease that causes hernia and skin.
Okay, hardening, right? That's the word you're using. Okay. Anybody else? Hardening, how about scarring? Scarring tissue. Multiple scars. So test question for all of you. We just talked about motor neurons. I've got this disease, MS, it attacks my motor neurons. I come to see you as a doctor and I sit there and say, you know, I'm not feeling very good lately. And as a matter of fact, my muscles feel strong or weak. If my motor neurons can no longer conduct an action potential, you're going to tell me that my muscles are strong or weak? Weak. Come on up here, Michael. Come on. Oh, right here. So, I'm the patient, he's the doctor, he sits there and says, hey, Ben, so why don't you get up on the exam table, and now you're going to put your hands against my shin. No, a little bit lower. There you go. And he's going to sit there and say, hey, I want you to extend your leg. And I do that, and I sit there, and he goes, harder. And I go, that's as far as I can do. What would you say? Does that seem like I'm really strong or relatively weak?
Does it seem that I'm strong or you're weak?
No, I'm asking you what I was doing. Did that seem like
Oh,
my
that's it.
muscles are producing a lot of force?
Not a lot.
Not a lot of force, that's right. And you'd sit there, thank you. This is what doctors do. When you go see a doctor for a checkup, they're going to do an annual muscle test. And they're simply trying to find out, are you able to push hard against their hands? And if you can, you got normal muscle strength. It's a very gross measure. Okay, family friend of mine, this true story. Her husband and her go to Chicago. He takes pictures of the trip. 2 weeks later, he's sitting down, he's looking at the pictures, and he says to her, he goes, that was a fantastic trip we had in Chicago. And she says to him, she goes, what are you talking about? She goes, we've never been to Chicago. Now you can imagine if you're talking to your friend and you just went on a trip somewhere, or a significant other, and you start talking about the trip. They're right there with you. They've got memories of that trip. And if they sat there and said, no, I never went on that trip, maybe you think you're joking. That's exactly what happened for about 5 or 10 minutes. And this husband and us is sitting there going, well, what? He goes, here's a picture of us right in front of the History Museum, the Art and History Museum in Chicago, which is a phenomenal place if you haven't been to Google. And she sits there and she goes, I don't remember ever going there. That's a pretty abnormal thing, right? So they go and see a doctor. The doctor has her sit up on a table. He says, I want you to extend your knee. And the doctor knows she's extremely weak. Then, next part of the visit is we're going to go have her have an MRI of her brain. And here's what they find, is that when they scan her brain, they see all these little white dots all throughout the brain. And those white dots are, quote unquote, the hardening, but I'm going to use the word scarring, of the neurons in her brain. And so, based upon a bunch of cumulative data, they come on, she's got MS, multiple sclerosis. Luckily, there are treatments out there that can slow down the progression of the disease, and she's done quite well with it. But MS is what's called a hyper-variable disease. That means that there are individuals that have a long amount of time between so-called attacks. That's, if you're going to have MS, that's what you want. The aggressive form is where the attacks of MS are very frequent. That has a much poorer prognosis to it. But this is an example of how things that affect the myelination of a neuron can have profound effects. And eventually what happens is these people lose their motor ability. They lose their ability to walk, or to walk properly. That could be a huge, huge issue. Okay, that's it. You guys are out of here. I'll see you back here.